For nearly a generation after the Persian Wars, one man set the course of Athens: Cimon, son of Miltiades, the victor of Marathon. He was Sparta's friend and Persia's scourge, a conservative aristocrat who swept the great king's forces from the Aegean, and who believed all the while that Athens and Sparta should be yoke-fellows, two oxen drawing the plow of Greece together. For a generation that image held. Then it shattered in 3 blows: a rebellion on a wooded island in the north, an earthquake that leveled Sparta, and a single humiliating rebuff on a mountainside in the Peloponnese. This is the story of how Cimon rose, how he ran an Athens yoked to Sparta, and how the friendship broke, pushing the two great powers toward open war. The leadership was not handed to him. In the years right after the war, Athens belonged to another man, and to understand Cimon's rise, you must first watch that man fall. Themistocles, son of Neocles, had stood at the front of Athenian politics for almost 15 years before Xerxes invaded, and he emerged from the war as the architect of Greek victory. At Salamis, through calculated deception, he had maneuvered both the reluctant Peloponnesians and the great king himself into fighting the naval battle Athens needed. No small feat of strategy. And again, he had kept Athens at the forefront of the Greek coalition. At the very moment when Sparta and her allies seemed ready to abandon Athenian interests altogether. The sharpest of those moments came in the spring of 479 BC. The Peloponnesians were deeply reluctant to march north of the Isthmus of Corinth and fight the decisive land battle. While they hesitated, the Persians invaded Attica again and sacked Athens a second time, a heavy blow even to a population that already knew its homes were gone. So Themistocles delivered an ultimatum to Pausanias, the regent who governed for Sparta's underage king Pleistocles. Unless the Peloponnesians committed fully to defending Attica against Mardonius, the Athenians would load their entire population onto ships and sail west to found a new city elsewhere. The threat worked. The Peloponnesians marched out and fought at Plataea. But mark what it took. Even in the hour of victory, the alliance was already strong. Then came the walls. Most Greek city-states had long stood unwalled. Under the traditional style of hoplite warfare, they lacked the means for great fortifications. Battles were fought between citizen levies, the defender marching out to stop an invader from burning his fields. In 479, the Spartan authorities, the Ephors, the kings, and the Gerousia, the council of elders, made Athens a suggestion. Rebuilding the city walls might be unwise, they said. A returning Persian army could seize a walled Athens and use it as a base. That was the stated reason. Themistocles, according to Thucydides and to many Athenians, saw the real one, a thinly veiled effort to keep Athens weak. Without walls, Athens could always be coerced by the Peloponnesian land army. So Themistocles ordered the population to build the city walls first, burned in the Persian sacks, thrown back up in desperate haste. Some of the finest sculptures Athens possessed, the Kouroi and Korai displayed today in the Acropolis Museum, were packed into the foundations as fill, anything to reach a defensible height quickly. Afterward came the walls of Piraeus, the harbor. These were the city's own circuits, distinct from the famous long walls of later years, 12 miles of parallel fortification linking city to port. When reports of the construction reached Sparta, Themistocles was summoned to answer for it. He stalled, drawing out the proceedings until word arrived that the walls were finished, then bluntly informed the Spartans that Athens would now look after her own interests. Thucydides traced the long fear and hatred that finally produced the Peloponnesian War back to this very episode. Most Spartans, tellingly, blamed the arrogance on the man rather than on the city, on Themistocles himself, the democratic leader. And Themistocles had indeed made a radical judgment. In 479, he concluded that Sparta, not a resurgent Persia, was the more serious threat, that Persia was effectively finished. In the long run, he was perhaps right. At the time, it was dangerous. Most Greeks still regarded Persia as a life danger, and a hard line against Sparta might well have provoked an early war. A war Athens could not have won and would have lost quickly. He also discovered the perennial problem of the democratic leader. The voters keep asking what you have done for them lately. He had used the law of ostracism to drive his rivals out of Athens, a weapon that works once. They would never let themselves be isolated again. He had won the great arguments of the past, to spend the silver of the mines on a fleet, to pay citizens for naval service, but those victories were behind him. In the lean years of reconstruction, he had little new to offer. He was a creature of the assembly, tied to the city, assembling majorities that had to be persuaded afresh each time. His conservative opponents led the expeditions overseas, Aristides the Just, who had helped organize the Delian League at Byzantium, and above all Cimon. They won the wars, they won the credit. Around 476, possibly 77, the date is uncertain. Themistocles was ostracized. The ostraca from that vote have been recovered on the Acropolis, and they carry a telling detail. The names were inscribed by only about 6 different hands on neatly clipped fragments of pottery. His opponents, it seems, distributed ready-made ballots so that even an illiterate voter would spell his name correctly. Ostracism proved the least of his troubles. He settled in the Peloponnese, helped organize a democracy at Argos, and made himself a general nuisance in Sparta's own backyard. The Spartans piled up complaints until his case came before a body sometimes called a Hellenic Council, apparently a remnant of the old anti-Persian alliance. The verdict went beyond ostracism, exile from Greece altogether. Through a series of misadventures, Themistocles landed on the coast of Asia Minor, Persian territory. Tradition holds that he spent 6 months mastering the Persian language, then wrote to the great king, probably still Xerxes, though some sources name his son Artaxerxes, with a memorable pitch. He was the Greek who had done the king the greatest harm. He was also the Greek who could now do him the greatest good. The persuasive tongue that had tricked Xerxes at Salamis now won its owner a domain in Asia Minor, where his descendants were still ruling generations later. The architect of Greek victory passed into comfortable retirement as a kind of Persian lord. Athens, meanwhile, was left to his opponents, and chief among them stood Cimon. In some ways, Cimon was an unlikely man to seize the leadership. Themistocles had been a populist, championing democratic policies, as Ephialtes, Pericles, and Alcibiades would after him. Cimon was, from the outset, a conservative. But he was a conscientious constitutionalist. He accepted the Athenian democracy as it stood, while believing that aristocrats ought to lead it. He submitted himself to the assembly for election without complaint and turned in his accounts for audit. He asked for no exemption from the machinery of the democracy he wanted aristocrats to run, and his loyalty to it was real. Later in his career, he personally intervened, at genuine risk to himself, to break up a possible oligarchic plot against the democracy. At the same time, Cimon openly admired Sparta, and never hid it. The admiration ran through his whole style of life. He named one of his sons Lacedaemonius after Lacedaemon, the region of Sparta. He served as Sparta's official prosenos in Athens, her guest friend, her standing host and advocate. And that office made him a network. As prosenos, he knew many Spartans personally, apparently including members of the royal house, men he had met at the Olympic Games and the great festivals. Spartan delegations arriving in Athens went straight to Cimon's house, and the Spartan dealings with Athens ran largely through him. He cultivated the terse, laconic style of speech the Spartans prized, short words plainly meant, over the fast competitive rhetoric of the Athenian assembly, and his stated policy was exactly the one he lived. Athens and Sparta should be yoke-fellows, drawing the plow of Greece together. To his own people he played the great patron. Athenian tribes were each built from 3 regional thirds, the treaties, and each third from local wards, the dems. To his fellow demesmen, Cimon showed conspicuous generosity. The tradition runs that meeting a poor man of his demi without a cloak, he would give him the cloak of his own back, though a servant always followed close behind, carrying a fresh one, which made the gesture something of a performance, even as men appreciated it. At harvest time he opened his orchards, and anyone could pick fruit at will. This was the traditional patronage of a great aristocrat, and his family, the Phyllides, stood near the origins of Athenian history itself. Some scholars have compared Cimon to the machine-style boss politicians of a 19th century city. The comparison is misleading. Cimon was one of the kaloi kagasoi, the beautiful and good, the men Athenians regarded as their natural leaders, and his conduct was exactly what tradition expected of such a man. Aristocratic society across the Mediterranean ran on reciprocal bonds. Cimon expected his demesmen to vote for him and follow him, and in return he owed them patronage, an exchange sanctified by religious and legal convention. The cloak and the open orchard bore votes. The votes brought commands. The commands brought home the plunder that paid for the next cloak. In this sense, Cimon was not a new kind of politician at all. He was a thoroughly traditional one. Cimon also carried a famous name, and a damaged one. His father, Miltiades, was the victor of Marathon, one of the 10 generals of 490 who pressed for the attack. He was regarded as an expert on Persia because he had fought in the Ionian Revolt, and he had once been suspected of setting up a tyranny at an Athenian settlement in the Troad, the region of ancient Troy. After Marathon, Miltiades led an expedition against the island of Peros, which had supported the Persians. The siege failed badly. He came home seriously wounded, was put on trial for military incompetence, and was heavily fined, an outcome that nearly ruined the family. When Cimon emerged in the years just after the Persian invasion, he was mounting a comeback for that damaged house, and the instrument was family. His sister Ep.9 was a striking figure in her own right, and the subject of persistent rumors about her relationship with her brother. She was married to Callias, the wealthiest man in Athens. Through shrewd marriage alliances and commercial ventures, the Phyllides restored their fortune and returned to political prominence. What the courtroom had nearly destroyed, marriage and commerce rebuilt. The assembly took notice. Cimon won its confidence, and it elected him general, again and again and again. To birth and connections add sheer ability. Cimon was a genuinely capable general and unusually skilled at the hardest kind of command, leading coalition forces. The allies liked serving under him. They felt he commanded in their interests. They watched the booty shared out fairly, and they watched him beat the Persians decisively. His campaigns are known mostly from a compressed account in the first book of Thucydides, a stretch historians call the Pentecontatia, Greek for the 50 years, the half-century between the Persian Wars and the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. Through that thin, precious record, we can follow what Cimon did with a decade of command. The first priority was the lifeline. Cimon devoted great effort to securing the Hellespont, the modern Dardanelles, and the Bosporus, the straits that guard the grain route into the Black Sea. Then he worked along the Thracian coast of northern Greece, clearing out the garrisons Xerxes had left behind, at Ion, where the river Strymon meets the sea, at Abdera, at strategic points like Ainos. One by one the Persian outposts fell, and the regions behind them were enrolled into the Delian League. The war against Persia was still being fought, and under Cimon, Athens was winning it. coastline by coastline. On the island of Skyros, in the middle of the Aegean, Cimon destroyed a nest of pirates and reportedly found something greater: the bones of Theseus, the legendary hero of Athens, known from the myth of the Minotaur and Ariadne. To the Athenians, Theseus was the ancestral founder of their people, and one tradition held that he had died on Skyros. Cimon carried the bones home, and Athens reburied them in solemn state, taking the recovery as a mark of divine favor. This was no trivial matter. Victory itself was a gift of the gods, and the Greeks watched intently for Kairos, an opportune moment, a divinely granted opening in which to act. There was a harder side to the work. Some league members found the assessments Aristides had organized burdensome. In these years, most allies still paid, because few Greeks yet believed Persia was truly beaten. But not all. Around 475, the date is disputed, Cimon forced the small city of Carystus on the island of Euboea into the league. The choice he offered was stark: join or see the city destroyed. Then, around 470, the island of Naxos in the central Aegean decided to secede from the league. Cimon was sent to suppress the revolt. Naxos was besieged, and Naxos surrendered. The terms imposed on Naxos set the pattern for every rebellious ally to come. Her walls were pulled down, a democracy was installed, her navy was confiscated, and she was reduced to a tribute-paying member. A taxpayer now, not a contributor of ships. Settlements like this would gradually transform the Delian League into an Athenian empire. Yet at the time, most of the allied states backed Cimon's action. Naxos, in their eyes, had broken the oaths sworn 6 or 7 years earlier at the League's founding, when the members dropped iron into the sea as the symbol of a binding commitment. Cimon remained broadly popular, the honest enforcer of a common oath. Yet Cimon's dominance rested on two long-term vulnerabilities. Here is the first. His victories depended on what we would now call amphibious operations, the highly skilled coordination of fleets and armies, and every such victory raised the confidence and the importance of the Cetes, the poorest class of citizens, the men who pulled the oars. The constitution had not caught up with them. Seats on the council were reserved for the top 3 property classes. The Cetes were excluded. The archonship was likewise limited to the wealthier classes, and above it all sat the Areopagus, the old aristocratic council, never abolished. It disciplined magistrates, scrutinized officials before office, the dokimasia, and audited their conduct after, the eusina. In time, the men who ruled were bound to grow dissatisfied with a leadership that neither advanced democratic reform nor opened high office to them. Radical Democrats would eventually strip the Areopagus of those powers and hand them to the popular court, to panels of ordinary citizens, largely the same seats who ruled in the fleet, now sitting in judgment. Cimon sponsored nothing of the kind, and there lay the trap. Every victory he won strengthened the demos his politics declined to reward. By the middle of the 460s, he was under serious attack from 2 men styled as radical Democrats, Ephialtes, and a rising figure named Pericles. The second vulnerability was his Spartan policy, and its unraveling began, ironically, with his greatest triumph. In 467 or 66, the year is uncertain, Cimon caught a Persian fleet and army at the Eurymedon River, on the southern coast of Asia Minor near Aspendos. He took them by surprise and destroyed the fleet on the beaches. The plunder was immense, such quantities of silver that Athens struck special commemorative coins, today among the rarest and the most prized in the whole Athenian series. The allies were richly rewarded. The Eurymedon was the crowning victory of the League's war, and it carried a hidden cost. The Battle of the Eurymedon made one thing plain to everyone. Persia was finished as a threat, and that was the crack in the League's foundation. For a decade, the fear of a Persian return had held the alliance together and made its burdens bearable. The assessments, the oaths, the ships owed every season, the Athenian admiral giving the orders. Cimon had just removed the fear. With the enemy gone, all of it needed a justification that no longer existed. And so the allies began to ask what Athens was actually for. Within a year or two, the question stopped being theoretical. A charter member of the League was about to walk out. In 465, Athens fell into a dispute with a charter member of the League, Sassos, a beautifully wooded island in the far northern Aegean. Sassos controlled a stretch of the mainland opposite, called the Perea, whose rich mines Herodotus valued at perhaps 300 talents a year. The Athenians laid claim to rights over those mines. Sassos seceded immediately, and Cimon led the combined Athenian and the League navy north to besiege it. A fleet of allies sent against a prosperous commercial power, an oligarchy, and a founding member of the alliance now blockading her harbor. In the second year of the siege, in 464, the Saracens did something dramatic. They appealed to the Spartan authorities. The sources call them vaguely tatele, those in final charge. Probably the Ephors, the Gerousia, and the two kings of the day, neither of them a figure of note. They agreed to put the matter before the Spartan assembly. What Sassos wanted was a Peloponnesian invasion of Attica to force Athens to lift the siege and respect Thessian autonomy and freedom, autonomia and Eleutheria. The appeal resonated because by now many Spartans believed four things. Athens had violated the League's founding oaths. Cimon was boldly using League forces to serve Athenian ambition. He was trampling the independence of a free state. And after the Eurymedon, no justification for the League remained at all. Athens, in Spartan eyes, stood in the legal and moral wrong. The assembly voted to invade. The invasion never came. Before it could be launched, a massive earthquake struck Sparta and leveled the city. Sparta had few monumental buildings, but a great deal of ordinary construction, and it came down on people. Many Spartans were killed. Then the disaster triggered revolt among the subject populations. Among the Perioikoi, the free residents of Spartan territory who lived under Sparta's control but held no citizenship, men rose in rebellion, and they were dangerous men, trained in heavy infantry arms. At the same time, many helots of Messenia, the subject district west of Laconia, revolted and organized their resistance on Mount Ithom, the great central massif of their country. Sparta suddenly faced a grave uprising at home. Invading Attica was out of the question. The Spartans also drew a religious conclusion. The seismos, the earthquake, the word survives in our seismic, was a sign of the god's displeasure. This was no kairos, no favorable moment. On the contrary, their own decision to invade Attica, it seemed, had offended the gods. And the Spartans appeared to have sincerely believed it. Caught now in a difficult siege of their own and forced to summon their allies, they could do nothing to stop Athens from reducing Sassos. In 463, the island surrendered. Its walls were pulled down. A democracy was imposed. The pattern of Naxos had claimed a charter member of the League. Cimon came home with his reputation somewhat tarnished. He faced charges of bribery, probably baseless, while the radical Democrats pressed their case that the time for further reform had come. By 462 or 61, he stood in real danger of ostracism, and then Sparta seemed to hand him a way out. So fearful were the Spartans of the Messenian revolt that they appealed to Athens for military aid, less than 2 years after voting to invade Attica. The request rested on the old oaths of the anti-Persian alliance of 480. For Cimon, it looked like salvation, proof delivered in front of his accusers that his whole policy still worked. Cimon and the assembly agreed, and he marched 4,000 hoplites into the Peloponnese. The Spartans had asked for a particular skill. Athenians excelled at siege warfare, and they excelled at it precisely because they knew how to build ships. The carpentry of the shipyards, honed in sieges across the Aegean, translated readily into the earthworks, towers, and engines that siege operations required. Ithome was a rebel fortress on a mountain. Athens was the power that knew how to take such places. On paper, the mission was the Plow of Greece made real, the two great cities campaigning side by side at last. It fell apart almost at once. Thucydides reports that the Spartans came to fear the Athenians as too revolutionary and disliked their manner. Plausible enough, the two peoples had not campaigned together in nearly a generation. There were command problems too. Cimon was more accustomed to giving orders than to taking them. In the end, the Spartans simply thanked the Athenians and sent them home. In Athens, this was a humiliating fiasco, and it was enough. Cimon was ostracized by his opponents. That strange episode of 462 and 61 pushed the two cities toward open war. Sparta now faced an Athens with no friend at the helm. In Cimon's place stood the radical democrats, Ephialtes and Pericles, men who had demanded sweeping reform for years. They had inherited Themistocles' conviction that Sparta was the true enemy, more dangerous as an oligarchy and no friend of democracy than any Persian king had ever been. For Sparta, this was the worst possible harvest of the rebuff at Ithome. She had sent home the one Athenian who argued her case, and the man who took his place owed her nothing. Then Ephialtes was assassinated under mysterious circumstances. Pericles was left in sole command, and he and the newly radicalized assembly were ready to confront Sparta. Their opportunity came through a chain of accidents. Megara defected from the Peloponnesian League and allied itself with Athens. A shock to the Spartans, who could scarcely believe so vital an ally would abandon them. In 461, Athens and Sparta went to war. The First Peloponnesian War, a conflict that would poison relations between the two cities ever after. And the revolt that had set it all in motion outlasted the friendship it destroyed. Only around 459 or later did the rebels on Ithome finally capitulate. It was Athens that took them in, helping resettle the survivors at Naupactus, a last ironic service to Sparta's enemies by the city Sparta had sent home. In the span of a single generation, the friendship had run its full arc, from the fall of Themistocles through the decade of Cimon's victories to the rupture of 462 and 61. The man who wanted Athens and Sparta to draw the plow of Greece together was cast out by his own people, ostracized exactly as Themistocles had been. And the men who replaced him were certain of the very thing he had spent his career denying, that Sparta, not Persia, was the enemy that mattered. What Themistocles had foreseen in 479 had at last come to pass. The two greatest powers in Greece were now openly at war.